June 6th, 1944. Dawn. Imagine standing on the French coast in the Pas-de-Calais region. It is quiet here. You can only hear the cry of seagulls and the sound of the English Channel surf. The sky is clear. No explosions. No planes. No landing craft. But if you turn around and look at the dunes behind you, you will see something strange. Thousands of German soldiers. Hundreds of Panther and Tiger tanks. Artillery crews ready for battle. This is the Wehrmacht's 15th Army, perhaps the most powerful and combat-ready force the Third Reich has left on the Western Front. 150,000 men in full combat readiness. They are staring at the sea. They are waiting. At this exact same moment, just 200 miles to the west, in Normandy, hell is breaking loose. The Allies are storming Omaha and Utah beaches. American Rangers are dying under machine gun fire. The fate of Europe hangs by a thread. German commanders in Normandy are screaming into telephones, demanding reinforcements. They beg for that very 15th Army, which is sitting idle in Pas-de-Calais. But Berlin answers, no. Not a single tank moves. Not a single soldier leaves his post. For 2 weeks after D-Day, this giant armada stood motionless while the Allies secured their foothold in France. Why? Why did Hitler and his generals voluntarily lose the war in Normandy? The answer lies in one name, a name that was spoken in German headquarters with animalistic fear mixed with professional admiration. They did not believe that the invasion in Normandy was the real blow. It seemed too simple to them. Too obvious. They were convinced it was just a diversion, because he was not in Normandy. General George Smith Patton, Jr. German intelligence reported directly to Hitler's headquarters. Patton is still in England. Therefore, the main blow is yet to come. Gerd von Rundstedt, the Reich's oldest field marshal, a man who despised almost all his opponents, was certain of one thing. The Americans would not dare launch a real attack without their best field commander. In the minds of the German command, Patton had turned into a mythical figure. They attributed supernatural abilities to him. They believed that wherever he appeared, the fate of the war would be decided. And while their spies reported that Patton was walking his white bull terrier around Dover, the 15th Army continued to wait for the real war, missing the actual one. It seems like madness. How could one man paralyze the strategic thinking of an entire empire? How did an American general manage to get inside the enemy's head so deeply that his very absence from the battlefield became a weapon more terrifying than a tank division? To understand this phenomenon, we need to rewind the tape. We need to forget the green fields of France and transport ourselves to where the Germans first met this hurricane. To a place where sand gets into your eyes and tanks turn into scorching ovens. North Africa. It was there, among the dunes of Tunisia, that this fear was born, and it was born on the ruins of American disgrace. February 1943. Tunisia, a place called Kasserine Pass. For American military history, this is a black mark. For the German Afrika Korps, it was a cakewalk. Rommel's experienced veterans looked at American soldiers not as opponents, but as prey. American Sherman tanks were burning by the dozens. Soldiers dropped their weapons and ran. Coordination was non-existent. German reports from that time drip with undisguised contempt. Wehrmacht officers wrote home that the Yanks were amateurs, rabble in nice uniforms, who knew how to drink Coca-Cola, but had no idea how to die for their country. It seemed the war in Africa was lost for the Allies before it had barely begun. The American army didn't just need a new commander. It needed a heart transplant. And on March 6, 1943, that heart arrived. George Patton stepped off the plane like a character from a Greek tragedy. He wore his famous ivory-handled revolvers, perfectly pressed breeches, and a look that could burn through armor. The first thing he did was not study the maps. He went to inspect the latrines and kitchens. He fined officers for not wearing ties in 100-degree heat. He shouted, he swore, and he demanded the impossible. Many soldiers hated him instantly. They called him old blood and guts. Our blood, his guts. But German intelligence noticed something else. The radio intercepts changed. The chaos in the ether vanished. The movement of columns became rhythmic, like the ticking of a metronome. Patton turned a rabble into a machine in just a few weeks. And when the Germans decided to test this new army's strength at the Battle of El Guetar, a surprise awaited them. It was the first time the U.S. Army defeated the Wehrmacht in a direct collision. Patton didn't just repel the attack. He anticipated the actions of the German tankers. He set traps exactly where they planned to break through. Legend has it that, looking at the burning German tanks, Patton shouted into the dusty air, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book." Whether he read it or not doesn't matter. What matters is that the German officers captured that day were in shock. Under interrogation, they said the same thing. "These are not the soldiers we beat at Kasserine. What did you do to them?" That was when a red folder with the name Patton appeared in the files of Fremde Heere West, Foreign Armies West. German generals, raised in Prussian traditions, saw a kindred spirit in him. He wasn't a bureaucrat like Eisenhower. He wasn't a cautious methodologist like Montgomery. He was a warrior, aggressive, fast, and ruthless. He understood the language of tank Blitzkrieg better than any of the Allies. Berlin realized the terrible truth for the first time. America, the land of factories and assembly lines, had produced a true warlord, a predator playing by German rules, but with American resources. By the summer of 1943, Patton had kicked the Germans out of Africa and lightning-fast captured Sicily, entering Palermo before the British. His star was at its zenith. It seemed nothing could stop him. German guns couldn't. Italian mines couldn't. But Patton had an enemy he couldn't defeat with tanks or artillery. This enemy sat inside him. And it was this enemy that nearly cost him his career, while gifting German intelligence the biggest puzzle of World War II. August 1943. Sicily, the field hospital of the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. The tent reeks of sweat, iodine, and fear. George Patton is walking among the wounded. He sees soldiers with missing limbs, bandaged, bleeding. He speaks to them softly, almost like a father. But then he approaches the cot of Private Charles Cool. There are no visible wounds on the soldier. He sits curled up, shivering. The medical chart reads, nervous exhaustion. For Patton, a man who believed in reincarnation and the spirit of the Spartans, these words were like a red rag to a bull. What happened next took less than a minute, but the echo of this event still resonates in military textbooks. Patton struck the soldier across the face with his glove. He threw him out of the tent, screaming that he would not tolerate cowards next to brave men. A week later, the situation repeated itself in another hospital. For the American press, it was the scandal of the century. General beats soldiers. Eisenhower was furious. He forced Patton to apologize publicly in front of the troops. And, most importantly, he effectively relieved him of command. Patton was stripped of his beloved 7th Army. While other generals went to London to receive medals and prepare for the invasion of France, Patton remained on Sicily, disgraced, lonely, commanding non-existent troops. It would seem like excellent news for the Germans. The enemy's most dangerous commander is out of the game. You can exhale. But the reaction of German intelligence was diametrically opposite. When reports of the slapping incident landed on the desks of analysts in Berlin, they laughed. Literally. The German high command refused to believe the official version. Judge for yourself from the perspective of a Prussian officer. Can you really fire a brilliant general who just captured Sicily simply because he slapped a private? In the Wehrmacht, discipline was maintained through fear. Execution for desertion was the norm. A slap? That's not even a violation of regulations. It's a corrective measure. German logic was ironclad. Americans cannot be such idiots. Therefore, this is a show. This is sophisticated disinformation. They decided that Eisenhower staged the scandal on purpose to hide Patton, to make the whole world think he was in disgrace, while in reality, he was preparing a secret army for the main strike. Instead of relaxing, the Germans tensed up like never before. They started looking for Patton everywhere. Abwehr agents reported his movements. Patton in Cairo, Patton on Corsica, Patton spotted in Malta. Any rumor was taken as fact. The Germans convinced themselves that the disgraced general was the ace in the hole. This is one of the bitterest ironies of the war. Patton sat in a villa in Palermo, writing depressive letters to his wife, thinking his career was over. He felt like an abandoned dog, and at the same time, in Hitler's headquarters, his name was written in bold on maps, awaiting a strike he physically could not deliver, and the Allies, seeing this paranoia, decided to play along. They realized, if the Germans want to see Patton at the head of a huge army so badly, let's give them that army, even if it's made of rubber and plywood. Spring 1944. The fields of Kent and the outskirts of Dover. If a German reconnaissance plane had flown over these areas at that time, and they did fly often, the pilot would have seen a terrifying picture. Endless rows of Sherman tanks lined up in battle formation, artillery parks, trucks loaded with fuel, huge tent cities with smoke rising from field kitchens. This was the first United States Army Group, FUSAG, the most powerful strike force ever assembled on the British Isles. 1 million soldiers, thousands of vehicles, and at the head of this armada stood the only man capable of leading such a force into battle, General George Patton. German analysts in Berlin looked at the aerial photos and nodded. It all added up. Patton is right opposite Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. This is exactly where he will deliver his fatal blow. But this army had one secret. If you went down to the field and tried to lean against the side of one of these Shermans, you would fall over. Because the tank didn't weigh 30 tons. It weighed 30 kilograms. It was made of rubber and pumped full of air. This was Operation Fortitude, the greatest hoax in military history. The Allies created a ghost army. Inflatable tanks, plywood planes, empty tents. Patton himself was furious. Imagine his state, a great warrior thirsting for blood, forced to play the role of a scarecrow in a garden. He wrote in his diary that he felt like an actor in a cheap theater. He traveled to towns, opened clubs for servicemen, gave loud speeches, knowing that German spies were catching his every word. His task was simply to be there, to shine his face and general stars to convince Hitler, I am here, wait for me here. But the visual deception was just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface, a radio game was being played. Hundreds of radio operators sat in empty fields, transmitting orders to non-existent divisions. They created the electronic noise of an entire army. They complained about a shortage of socks, requested spare parts for tanks, congratulated each other on birthdays. The German Radio Intercept Service listened to all of this and meticulously plotted Patton's new regiments on their maps. For them, this ether noise was more real than the silence in Normandy. And here is the key moment. The most powerful Allied weapon on D-Day did not fire a single shot. That weapon was Patton's reputation. When the real invasion began in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Hitler hesitated, but the German General Staff was calm. They said, this is not the real invasion. This is a diversion. Patton is still in Dover. We hear his radio. We see his tanks. The real blow will be in Calais. A day passed. 2. A week. The Allies seized bridgeheads, but the Wehrmacht's 15th Army in Pas de Calais continued to stand still, staring into the empty horizon. They were waiting for Patton. Even in mid-July, when the fighting in Normandy reached its peak, the Germans kept their best reserves in the east, fearing the Ghost Army. Patton bought time for the Allies without even entering the battle. But this couldn't last long. The general was boiling with impatience. He begged Eisenhower to take the muzzle off. And finally, in late July, the order came. Patton was secretly transferred to France. The inflatable tanks were deflated. The radio games ceased. The Ghost vanished, only to materialize in Normandy, no longer as a myth, but as steel and fire. And when the Germans realized they had been fooled, it was too late. Something was coming at them that they were completely unprepared for. August 1st, 1944, noon, Normandy. In the headquarters of the German 7th Army, the phone rings. The communications officer on the other end is screaming. He reports that American tanks have broken through the front line. "Where are they now?" asks the general. "I don't know, sir," the voice replies. "They were here 5 minutes ago, and now they are in my rear." At that moment, the Germans still didn't understand what had happened. They were used to the slow, methodical war waged by Montgomery, step by step, field by field. But on this day, the rules of the game were rewritten. George Patton officially assumed command of the U.S. Third Army, and he pulled the trigger. What followed, German historians would later call the American Blitzkrieg. Irony of fate, the tactic of lightning war, invented by the Germans, was now being used against them. But Patton took it to an absurd, terrifying perfection. His tanks didn't capture cities. They simply bypassed them. His infantry didn't clear every house. They rode on the armor, jumping off only for short firefights. Patton's motto was simple: hold the enemy by the nose and kick him in the rear. The German command and control system simply collapsed. Wehrmacht staff officers looked at maps and saw sheer chaos. The red arrows of the American advance moved faster than German couriers could deliver retreat orders. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge wrote to Hitler in despair, "This is madness. They don't pay attention to flanks. They just rush forward." In any military academy in the world, from West Point to Berlin, cadets are taught, protect your flanks, or you will be encircled. Patton threw that textbook in the mud. When his staff officers timidly noted that his army was stretched into a thin line and open to attack, he barked, "Let the enemy worry about my flanks." And the Germans really did worry. They were so frightened by the speed of the Third Army that they didn't even think about counterattacking. It seemed to them that there were not hundreds of thousands of Americans, but millions. Patton was everywhere. Archives preserve the interrogation of a German colonel captured in August. He told the American interrogator, "We knew where Montgomery was. We knew where Bradley was. But Patton, today he is here, and tomorrow he is 100 kilometers away. We were afraid to sleep because we thought we'd wake up as prisoners." In 1 month, Patton's army liberated a territory the size of France. They moved so fast that supplies couldn't keep up. Maps ran out. Tankers drove using Michelin tourist guides bought before the war. There was a moment when the tanks stopped, not because of the enemy, but because the tanks were dry. Patton ordered the hijacking of fuel trucks destined for other armies. He stole gas from his own side, just to keep moving. "My men can eat their belts," he said, "but my tanks have got to have gas." By September 1944, the German Western Front virtually ceased to exist as an organized force. The road to Germany was open. Patton begged Eisenhower to give him more resources, assuring him he could end the war in 10 days. German generals agreed with him. Rundstedt was already preparing defense plans for the Rhine, realizing France was lost. The fear of the cowboy general reached its peak. It seemed nothing in the world could stop this runaway train. But then happened what Patton feared more than the SS. The political map changed. Supplies were given to Montgomery for his ill-fated Operation Market Garden. The Third Army's tanks came to a halt. Rains washed away the roads, and Hitler, taking advantage of the pause, gathered his last strength for a strike that was supposed to be the grave of the Allies. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The temperature drops to -20. The fog is so thick you can't see your own hand. And in this white haze, the roar of hundreds of German Tigers erupts. Hitler went all in. He threw the Reich's last reserves into a desperate attack, hoping to split the Allies and capture the port of Antwerp. American defenses were crushed. Thousands of soldiers were surrounded. In the center of this icy hell was the small town of Bastogne, held by the 101st Airborne Division. The Germans encircled them. The situation seemed hopeless. The paratroopers had no winter clothes. Ammunition and food were running out. The German commander sent an ultimatum to surrender. American General McAuliffe answered with one word: nuts. But bravery alone was not enough. They needed a miracle. On December 19th, Eisenhower called an emergency meeting in Verdun. Gloom reigned in the room. The maps showed a catastrophe. Eisenhower asked his generals, "Who can hit the Germans in the flank and save Bastogne?" Everyone was silent. Logistics dictated that turning an army around and redeploying forces would take at least a week. By that time, Bastogne would fall. And then George Patton rose from his chair. He looked the Supreme Commander in the eye and said, "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours." Silence hung in the room. Other generals thought Patton had lost his mind. Turn an entire army advancing east, rotate it 90 degrees north, and throw it into battle over icy roads in 2 days. It was physically impossible. It contradicted the laws of physics and military science. Eisenhower said, "George, don't be fatuous." But Patton was already calling his headquarters with the code word, "play ball." What happened in the next 2 days is something German historians still study with bewilderment. Patton performed a logistical miracle. 130,000 soldiers, 20,000 vehicles, thousands of tons of supplies turned on a dime and rushed north. Without radio communications, in total darkness, on ice. German intelligence slept through this maneuver. General Brandenberger, commanding the German 7th Army, was sure Patton's flank was securely pinned. He couldn't believe Americans were capable of such flexibility. The Germans thought they were fighting a clumsy giant, but before them stood an acrobat with muscles of steel. But Patton had one enemy left he couldn't defeat with tactics: the weather. Snow and fog kept Allied aviation grounded. Tanks slid. Soldiers froze. And then Patton did what finally cemented his status as a legend. He summoned his chaplain, Colonel O'Neill, and ordered him to write a prayer. Not just a prayer, but a combat request to God for good weather. The chaplain was embarrassed, but an order is an order. The text was printed on thousands of cards and distributed to the soldiers. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee, restrain these immoderate rains. Grant us fair weather for battle." It sounds like a myth, but it is a historical fact. The next day, December 23rd, the sky over the Ardennes suddenly cleared. The sun flooded the snow-covered fields. Thousands of American fighters and bombers took to the air, unleashing a fiery hell on the German columns. On December 26th, Patton's tanks broke the encirclement and entered Bastogne. The siege was lifted. For the German command, this was the end. Not just the end of the operation, but the end of hope. They realized they lost, not because of the enemy's numbers, but because of his skill. General von Manteuffel, commanding the Panzer Army, later admitted, "We never thought the Americans could move that fast. Patton broke our back in the Ardennes." After that Christmas, the fear of Patton turned into fatalism. The Germans knew, if the Third Army is on the horizon, resistance is futile. Now the path lay in only one direction, into the heart of Germany, to the Rhine. And Patton was about to cross that river in a very peculiar way. March 1945. The Rhine River, the sacred frontier of Germany. on the other bank, the heart of the Reich. Bernard Montgomery, the British field marshal, was preparing a grandiose operation to force the river. He was amassing thousands of guns, millions of shells, inviting the press, including Winston Churchill himself. It was supposed to be the main show of the end of the war. But the day before the show began, Montgomery received a message. George Patton was already on the other bank. Without artillery preparation, without loud speeches, the Third Army threw pontoon bridges across near Oppenheim and crossed the river right under the Germans' noses. Patton stopped in the middle of the bridge. He unzipped his fly and urinated into the waters of the Rhine, straight from the pontoon. Photographers captured this moment. In a report to Eisenhower, he wrote, "I have just pissed into the Rhine River. For God's sake, send some gasoline." For the German command, this was the final nail in the coffin. Albert Kesselring, who replaced Rundstedt, simply didn't know what to do. Patton broke any defensive lines faster than they could be built. He was rushing toward Berlin, toward Prague, toward Vienna. But the war was ending. And for Patton, this was a tragedy. He was a man created for battle, not for peace. "God, how I love it," he said, looking at a battlefield. "I love it more than my life." And in this desperate desire to prolong the war, he made his darkest mistake. In late March, deep in the German rear, lay the POW camp Oflag, 5th B. Patton's son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, was held there. Patton, violating direct orders, sent a small task force Bomb, to liberate the camp. 300 men, 50 tanks. They had to drive 60 kilometers through enemy territory. It was a suicide mission. The Germans destroyed Bomb's detachment almost completely. The son-in-law was not saved. He was wounded. Patton lost men for personal ambitions. German propaganda rejoiced, but even in this rejoicing, there was fear. This crazy American is ready to send tanks anywhere, even to hell, if he feels like it. May 8th, 1945. Victory. The guns fell silent. For the world, it was a celebration. For Patton, a funeral. He was stripped of his war. He was appointed military governor of Bavaria, put behind a desk to shuffle papers. He hated it. He said they should arm the Germans and go fight the Soviet Union. He was relieved of his post. December 9th, 1945. Outskirts of Mannheim. A gloomy day. Patton is going hunting in his 1938 Cadillac. He is relaxed. He points to the rusted carcasses of tanks on the roadside and says to his driver, "Look at that, how awful war is." A second later, a heavy GMC Army truck turns left, right in front of the general's car. The impact wasn't hard. The bumper was bent. The glass shattered. All passengers got off with bruises, except one. George Patton lay in the back seat. He said, "I think I'm paralyzed." He had broken his neck. The man who walked through the fire of 2 world wars, who survived machine gun fire and bombings, was paralyzed in a ridiculous traffic accident on a quiet road. He lay dying in a Heidelberg hospital for 12 days. And here is what is amazing. The news of his accident instantly spread through the camps of German prisoners of war. Thousands of former Wehrmacht and SS soldiers discussed the news. There was no joy. There was no gloating. There was a strange, grim respect. One of the German generals, hearing of Patton's death on December 21st, said, "This is the wrong death. Men like him should die by the bullet, not in bed." Patton was buried in Luxembourg, together with his soldiers who died in the Ardennes. He refused a spot at Arlington Cemetery in Washington. He wanted to stay with his army, but Patton's history did not end with his death, because those who knew him best remained, his enemies. It was in post-war interviews, when the fear had settled, that German generals revealed the true reason for their awe of him, and these words speak louder than any medals. 1946, high-ranking POW camps. British military theorist Basil Liddell Hart conducts a series of interviews with the elite of the Wehrmacht. Before him sit the men who conquered Europe: Gerd von Rundstedt, Günther Blumentritt, Hasso von Manteuffel. They smoke cheap cigarettes, drink cold coffee, and dissect the reasons for their defeat. Little Hart asked each of them the same question: which Allied commander do you rate the highest? The answers were surprisingly unanimous. Not Montgomery. They considered him too cautious. Montgomery never attacked until he had a 10-to-1 advantage, grumbled Rundstedt. Not Bradley. They respected him, but did not fear him. They named Patton. General Blumentritt, Rundstedt's chief of staff, formulated it best. We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies. He was the one who dared to exceed the limits of reasonable risk. He fought the way we were taught in Prussia. Speed is more important than safety. Audacity is more important than supply. In these words lies the main secret of the fear Patton inspired. The Germans were used to fighting the American system, a giant machine of logistics and artillery. But Patton was a glitch in that system. He was chaos. He was an individualist in a war that had become faceless. Manteuffel, who fought against him in the Ardennes, added, he had an amazing sense of the moment. He saw the battlefield not as a map, but as a living organism. He knew when the enemy was weak, even if intelligence said otherwise. Patton was a mirror for the German generals. In him, they saw a reflection of Guderian and Rommel from the times of their greatest victories. The irony is that the most German general in spirit of this war turned out to be an American from California, who believed that in a past life, he was Caesar's legionnaire. Today, if you go to Luxembourg, to the American cemetery in Hamm, you will see endless rows of white crosses, 5,076 graves. There is no VIP box here. There is no pompous mausoleum. George Patton's grave is not at the head of the formation, as befits a general, but right in front of his soldiers, facing them, between two simple privates. He lies in the same place as his tankers, infantrymen, and medics. This is the perfect ending to his story. Because, despite all his flaws, rudeness, scandals, and ego, the soldiers loved him, and the enemies feared him. German generals feared him not because he hated Nazis. They feared him because he loved war more than they did. He was the absolute warrior, a relic of a bygone era when the outcome of a battle was decided not by accounting, but by the will of one man. In the end, George Patton proved one simple truth that America remembered forever. To defeat monsters, sometimes you need a monster of your own. And thank God, in 1944, that monster was on our side.